Hi, Misha here, and well, a batch of West German Walther, or if you prefer Walther, PPs recently hit the market. Police surplus, 60s, early 70s dated, used, good condition guns. So I thought, let's do another video on the PPK series, since there's not a whole lot new to talk about in the world. And the last time we revisited this was during the GoldenEye video, did about a year and a half ago, which was a really fun video to do. And of course, James Bond is one of the reasons this gun is famous. Others are its military and police service. So I don't know, we're gonna hang out and talk about what I feel are some really cool guns. I've always had a soft spot for Walthers. I think their quality, innovation, and frankly perseverance, attribute to themselves. They've been around for nearly 110 years now as a company. So with that, I'll set this aside and talk about how the PP, the Palazzo pistol, police pistol, got started. And first and always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Also check out live streams, we're starting to do those. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out Patreon. And let's just dive in and start with the Model 4 briefly, because this is really the first Walther military pistol. Carl Walther established the company, and it originally made sporting shotguns and such. Their first handgun was the Model 1 in 1910, give or take a year. It's a little debated. And at that time, it was FN Herstal in Europe that led the pocket automatic market. Colt in the US, along with Savage, were kind of the important ones there. And so that's what they were competing with. The early models were either in 25 or 32. And this is a militarized version of the Model 3. Essentially, they put on a barrel extension, or a longer barrel I should say, and a slide extension, and they extended the magazine and grip out. Not unlike what FN would do later with the Model 1922 from the 1910. And in 1915, the Imperial German military would order 250,000 Model 4s, delivering them throughout World War I, and it was a pretty common officer's sidearm. These are chambered for 7.65, 32, single action only. These early models, Model 1 through 9, were either striker fired or internal hammer fired, simple blowback guns, and really where the company got its start. They did attempt the Model 6 during the war, but that didn't go anywhere. It was a blowback 9mm, and that would lead to the Model 7 and Model 8, and the last of the model numbers would be the 9. Here's my early 4, here's my later 1920s production 4. Notice the rear sight versus the trough, also exposed sear bar versus internal. So they continued to update the design. But in 1929, they halted Model 4 production as they were ready to introduce its replacement. And while the Model 4 was a good gun, it wasn't really pushing firearms technology forward. But its replacement certainly would. In the late 20s, during the Weimar era, work was underway for the PP. Size-wise, it was just slightly larger than the 4, with a 3.86 inch barrel, just under 6.7 inches long, and weighing in at about 23.5 ounces unloaded. Again, chambered for 7.65, 32, and again, a simple direct blowback gun. But now we have an exposed hammer and decocker that also doubles as a safety. And of course, as everyone knows today, being double action was its big claim to fame. While on the drawing board, this was not the first double single action pistol for mass production and actually getting into the market effectively. It was the first to hit the market when it appeared in 1929/1930. And it was designed for police. When you look over across the pond to America, well, U.S. law enforcement preferred revolvers for a few different reasons, but this was in vogue. In Europe, though, small automatics were in vogue, typically in .32, sometimes other calibers, but typically .32. This was felt to be better suited for the urban environment they patrolled and protected and worked in. And that's why the PP is actually a little bit larger than previous pocket guns, because it was meant to be a duty gun, a service gun. Small enough for carry, but large enough for comfortable handling. 8-shot mag. You'll find them with and without the finger extensions, and you'll find them with and without lanyard rings. This is, of course, as I said at the beginning, a West German post-war version, but they were introduced in the 30s and became vastly popular. That same year, 1930, development would begin on the compact version intended for plainclothes detectives and others needing a smaller and somewhat lighter version, and it was quickly introduced in 1931 as the famous PPK. This is a original German one from that era. Note that it has the flush magazine. So first off, shorter barrel at 3.26 versus 3.86 inches, so 0.6 over half an inch shorter. This would of course give it an overall length of just under 6.1 inches. So, yep. The grip too was shortened by roughly a 1/4 inch, and this would lead to a reduced capacity magazine. Here they are, PP on the left, PPK on the right, with and without finger rest. Typically a gun would ship with one of each, but different orders could vary. 8-round for the PP, 7-round for the PPK. That's of course in 7.65-32, which was the primary production model in Germany. The Germans preferred that caliber, but 380 9mm Kerrs would appear, and in that case the magazine would reduce down to 7 and 6 respectively. But those were mostly just for export, because 32 was the standard, and it was felt sufficient for the needs in the 30s and really for the next few decades. Both were offered concurrently. Obviously, the PP with the longer grip and barrel would be more comfortable, giving a longer sight radius and a longer barrel, but the PPK was better in the terms of weight, and it was more rounded, easier to put in a pocket holster. I will say, like I said, this was about 23.5 ounces. This was a little bit under 21.5 ounces. So they saved a little over 2 ounces by reducing. And one neat feature, notice on the PP we have a metal backstrap and 2-panel grip. On the PPK we have a wraparound grip. Not only is this potentially more ergonomic and comfortable, it also does save weight because you have less metal. If you were to take the grip off, there's the mainspring directly under it. And we have a simpler, lighter, fixed lanyard ring, lanyard staple, as I kind of think of them, under the bottom. This would be a very popular export for Walther, as well as purchased by several government agencies, police departments, bank services, and eventually the military once the Nazis came around, and was a very common sidearm and very famous today. The PPK really got a lot of the attention, but the PP just really was the good standard gun. And in World War II, we'll see some variations and experimentation too. One variant I find particularly interesting was the PPK Dural. Dural was basically an aluminum alloy, which appeared really before World War I, and was used in lots of applications, including the aircraft industry. But in the late 30s, Walther started experimenting with it, to save weight. And their very first Dural frame guns appeared around 1939, and they'd build them in small batches until 1942. This saved several ounces, around 3 or 4, bringing the weight of the PPK down to 18 or so. And you really do feel it in your hands. This is a very svelte little gun. The metal was anodized for what it's worth. And the final run of these, well, they were done in 43, maybe into 44, using leftover frames built earlier in the war, like this one here. And after the Dural PPKs were assembled at Walther, located in the city of Zella-Mehlis, that would be the final run of these during World War II. But the PP would actually continue on until war's end. Here's my late war version. One of the first things they did for the PP is they went away from the synthetic grips because of material shortages to just simple slab side wood grips. They also would stop putting the full Walther banner on the side by 1945, going to the AC marking, which was the code, but they didn't year date these, so they just said AC instead of Walther. And they skipped some machining steps as well. If you look here, you see a little step down. Well, not on the Dural, I should say, but it's for strength. And they continued that on with the steel frame of the late war, removing the cutout there. And they also removed one feature. With your standard PPK, there's a spring-loaded chamber indicator here. Just a simple pin that when a cartridge is in, sticks out. Kind of wish I had a snap cap to show you, but yeah. But the more they decided that was something they could skip, saved them a pin, a spring, and most importantly, machining out the slide. And just overall, a few other small machining, polishing steps were skipped. This makes the bluing on these late war guns seem very matte, very dull, almost a grayish color. And in fact, some components weren't even blued. They were actually phosphated. As an example, this one has a magazine with a phosphate finish. It's kind of a zinc phosphate they used. And it wasn't just here. Some other small parts on PPs would be phosphated. Walther's own P38 was phosphated, and of course Mauser themselves famously used phosphated parts on quite a few of theirs. Now, the PPK, as I said, production would end with that around 1943, 1944, with some of the old Dural frames being pulled out to finish out. But the PP itself would continue on right up until war's end, when the Walther factory in Zella-Mehlis was captured April of 1945. Actually, quite a few servicemen took trophy Walthers home, some of them being assembled for them by the workers, probably in exchange for food or cigarettes or what have you. And these all were very popular guns. Well, the PP was carried by German police and the German military. The PPK was often carried by the Luftwaffe, as well as the SS and many others. And of course, as famously known, Hitler had at least 2 PPKs, including a gold one. Himmler had one as well. It was a thing, it was around, and they built these in quite large numbers. It's hard to get exact numbers, but probably 3 million more PPKs built between 1929 and 1945, and some would end up in French and other European service, and it set a trend. A lot of nations, for example Hungary, would copy and be inspired by the PPK design to make their own handguns. In particular, the double single action trigger system was very, very popular. And with that, so if pre-war police and wartime isn't of interest to you, I'm sure James Bond's Walther PPK is. And a fun fact that I always like to tell people, his was actually French, at least in the beginning. The PP7 special issue. So, the original owner and founder, Carl Walther, died during World War I, and his 3 sons, including Fritz, would inherit the company, and Fritz would be the one that would carry on the company and the Walther name. But in 1945, well, Germany was a conquered and divided nation, west and east, and the Zellmelis factory found itself in the Soviet zone of occupation. So Fritz Walther took what drawings, blueprints, patents, licensing he could in a briefcase and went west and, well, soon moved to West Germany and established a new factory in the city of Ulm. But they could not make firearms. This was not allowed in occupied West Germany in the 1940s, so the Walther factory made business equipment, adding machines and the like. And in 1951, negotiations began with a French conglomerate known as Herein, and they would produce under license guns with and for Walther, namely the PP and PPK. It took a little time to set things up, and in 1953, been saying 40 enough, the first Herein, the first French guns would turn out of the factory. Interestingly, the first PPs they built had wood grips, but they weren't the checkered, kind of blocky grips of World War II. They were smooth, well-rounded wood grips. I actually had a gun once that was a Herein PP built in the early 50s. One of the guns I should have kept, but oh well. But I have kept this one, their PPK, which came out a short time later. Of course, they had Bakelite grips. And they would become the sole manufacturer of these for several years. And they would make a few changes. In the front of the pre-war and wartime guns, you'll notice there's a bit of a sharp edge here on the end of the slide, even carrying over to the durail. Herein got rid of that. Makes sense, considering this is meant to be a carry gun. The rear sight also changed a bit, a little bit larger, a little bit more squared off. And maybe most importantly, the material of the grip, a Bakelite, was improved. If you get a pre-war or wartime gun, it's almost always cracked in the back or completely broken apart. Part of it is just the aging. Part of it is people over-tightening these grips, because if you over-tighten the screws, it pinches in, and then you go to shoot it. Yeah, and it's just part of it's just the Bakelite style of the time. They improved that with the Walther Manurhin guns here. So, when Jeffrey Boothroyd in 1956 told Ian Fleming that James Bond should carry a PPK, the ones in production at the time and the ones that the film crew would have access to in 1960-61 were actually French-made. And they were in .32, which a lot of people think he carried the .380, but he did not. In fact, that was an improvement. Before that, he carried a 6.35 caliber Beretta, which is not ideal for what he did. And Fleming would introduce the PPK to the series with the book Dr. No in 1958, and the rest, as they say, is history. And it was carried in a more traditional leather belt/waist holster, and had the blued finish, and again was Manurhin, which is fun. So you might be asking, what about the factory in Ulm? This is where the story gets a little more convoluted. In 1955, West Germany would be reforming a military, becoming the Bundeswehr, and arms production would again be allowed in the nation. And Karl Walther, under Fritz Walther, already being established, was at the forefront. In fact, the first service sidearm of the Bundeswehr would become the P1, beginning in 1957, which was an updated P38 from the wartime. And it wouldn't be long before guns would come out of the Ulm factory, PP and PPK. However, what's sometimes known, sometimes isn't, the components, slide, receiver, frame, were actually made still in France, at least the forgings. They were sent to West Germany for final fitting, final finishing, and proof testing. And by European law, that meant they were manufactured in West Germany, not France. So at a time, you had both West German and Manurhin marked guns coming out, but they were all based on the same parts from the same factory in France, just final finishing and whatnot. And there was a political element too, because it wasn't not just the West German army reforming. West German police, which had previously been equipped with leftover guns or guns given to them by the West, needed new pistols. And again, they decided that the PP, amongst others, was sufficient in the 1960s. So here's mine here. Slightly different one. They were mass produced, and again mostly in .32 for their own consumption. And in 1964, Karl Walther in Ulm would actually reintroduce the Dural version, or at least an alloy frame version, as the PPK-L. And both it and the standard PPK would be adopted by the Swiss Air Force. Typically, pilots would carry the L, and the standard ground crews would carry the PPK if they needed a sidearm. I always find that kind of interesting, that the PPK-L was officially military hardware. They never were built in huge numbers, but they were built, and of course there would also be a PP-22, PPK-22, chambered for, you guessed it, 22 long rifle. Over the years, there would even be a small number, going back to the 1930s even, of 25 caliber guns, but these were always unique runs. And of course, there's always special versions, wood grips, gold finishes, silver finishes, inlays. But I collect and am mostly interested in guns. of standard production and that I can shoot. So, what went wrong again? Why was the PPK banned? Why are originals relatively hard to find, yet you can still get surplus PPs coming in to this day? That's kind of why we decided to do this video again. Well, that's because of the USA. And firearms rules, regulations, gun control, if you will, is not new at all. Of course, in 1934, there was the National Firearms Act. In 1968, though, the Gun Control Act was finally passed by Congress and signed by the President, and it had several goals that impact a lot of things. But when it comes to handguns, where they targeted were the prevention of quote-unquote Saturday night specials, cheap imports that could be bought, used for nefarious purposes, and then thrown in a creek. Now, one thing the Gun Control Act did was standardize serial numbers. While most guns had a serial before '68, it wasn't strictly required. Now it would be. And we think of German guns as high quality, and they definitely are, at least some of them, but almost everywhere had just cheap little guns. There were fly-by-night German companies that made cheap little guns, and so you could go to a pawn shop and buy a gun for a couple of bucks. And it may not work more than a few hundred rounds, but that wasn't really what was needed. Don't believe me? Go look up, Ravens and Lorsons and all that stuff that floated around even when I was a kid. But that was the whole idea behind the quote-unquote points system, to try to keep cheap guns out and too small, too light guns out. To be imported now, guns had to meet points. Now, the PP was fine. It met the point systems. They looked at features. They looked at size, weight, safety, all that. Unfortunately for the PPK, it missed it by 1 point. It was too light by about 1 ounce. That meant that the PPKL was definitely too light. And it was too short. They measured it both length and height-wise. It was a little too small. So in 1968, the PPK and PPKL, and for that matter even the .22 version, were effectively banned from import into the USA. It didn't matter if they came from West Germany, France, or Timbuktu. They just did not meet the point systems. But the PP did, which is why we continue to see these. Back in this era, Inner Arms was the primary importer, and actually they would remain so for a very long time. And this would lead to an interesting variant that became probably more popular than it had any right to. The PPK-S. What Walther did was quite clever. They took the PP frame with its longer grip, and it was also heavier. Notice the back strap and grips. And they paired it with the shorter barrel and slide of the PPK. So this is still shorter. This added just enough weight and just enough dimensional length / height for it to qualify. They also gave it a feature, a quote-unquote target trigger, ribbed trigger. Another feature that a lot of other manufacturers used, not Walther, but for example MAB in France, were target grips. Those are the thumb rest grips that are kind of infamous, but they went for the target trigger. Fun fact, Glock did the same thing for the Glock 19. Now, this was not a bad thing. Sometimes when you have to have one mashed together for imports, it looks like a dog's breakfast. But this actually ended up as a pretty good gun. In fact, the target trigger, the rib trigger, would appear on a lot of later production European PPs and PPKs. The shorter barrel was still appreciated over the longer one on the PP. But we have the longer grip with the extra round, be it in 32 or 30 or 380, which made it a more comfortable gun. That's why this is actually my shooter, my PPK S, as it was known, PPK/S. Some say the S stands for sporting, some disagree. This one's interesting. It's a 1969 date, which was first year production for this variant, and this is actually police surplus out of Europe. So these were kind of stumbled upon accidentally as a very cool variant combination, and they were compliant for importation, bringing the PPKS to America alongside the PP and many other guns. And this would almost be the final stage in the evolution of the handgun. But we have one more variant to talk about quickly. For 4 decades, German law enforcement felt perfectly equipped with just a 32, and the PP/PPK was a very safe pistol to carry with one in the chamber. With the decocker and double/single action, it was very safe and advanced for the time. We've talked about West Germany, but I will just mention briefly East Germany, quote-unquote, manufactured some PPs as well, some from existing parts, and as I said, the original factory fell under the Soviet zone anyway. And you'll see these carried by East German police, also the Stasi and others, and some would even make their way to other places in Eastern Europe, and heck, even the Commandant in Red Dawn in 1982 carried a Walther, although presumably it was meant to be East German. But things were changing in the late 60s. There were anarchist groups, there were communist red groups fighting terrorist groups. This would lead to the Munich massacre and the feeling that now that body armor and just other things were coming into vogue, West German law enforcement needed something larger and more powerful. In 1972, there were 2 contenders for the next West German police, law enforcement, and security defense agencies new cartridge. The traditional 9mm Parabellum, 9x19 Luger, later 9mm NATO, and this 9mm Police, 9x18, which actually can have its roots traced back to World War II as well, when the Luftwaffe did research to see just how powerful of a cartridge they could fit in a straight blowback gun. And this would result in 9x18 9mm Ultra during the war, but it didn't really go much of anywhere. Now, if remember the name 9x18, you think Makarov. Yes, this was the starting point, 9mm Ultra, for both 9x18 Makarov, 9mm PM, and 9x18 Police, 9mm Police. So while the Russians would develop Makarov earlier, in 1972, West Germany would have their own variant. Now, they're not interchangeable. I'm sure you know that, but it needs to be mentioned, mostly because the bullets themselves are a different diameter. Whereas the German bullet was just a hair over actually 9mm, the Soviet bullet was actually almost 9.25 millimeters wide, at least 9.2. So yeah, you get it. But they were both designed to work with a straight blowback gun. And so a few companies made 9mm police guns, including Walther here, with what they called the PP Super. And since the PPK had been offered in 9mm Kurz, 9x17, 380 for decades, at first you might just think that, well, they just took that and added an extra millimeter. And you could be easily forgiven for that. But no, the PP Super is effectively an all-new design because they look to address a few other issues in terms of service gun too. Dimensionally, it's larger than a PP at about 6.9 inches versus around 6.7, but it actually has a shorter barrel at about 3.6 inches. Remember, the PPK has about a 3¼ inch barrel, and the PP has about 3.863 and a little under 3.9. So the barrel is actually in between, and the overall length is partially the cartridge and partially a new system back here. It has a steel frame. Kind of interesting they didn't go with alloys since they had the PPKL, but I guess they were worried about stressing that, even though they had the P1 with the alloy frame. So this thing is heavy and kind of chunky. It's roughly 27 ounces unloaded, making it heavier than a lot of things. We have some interesting features too, including a slide stop. You may have noticed, going back to the Model 4, the PP, PPK, while they do have last round hold opens, even with the mag pulled out, there's no external release. The P38 P1 had one, but these never did before. But I guess now Walther felt it was a necessary feature, so it was added. Of course, you can pop the mag out, it stays open, and you can release it. Mag is unique, holding 8 rounds of 9x18. And of course it is a traditional double single action, but we have a new firing pin safety. The firing pin actually pivots out of the way, and even the head fits in a pocket on the hammer, and it only lines up to be hit if the trigger is being held back. Now we don't have a safety, we just have a decocker. See, it springs back afterwards. A common feature for police guns. So we have a new safety system, which is why there's a little bit more room back here to fit the new firing pin and that. We also have a bobbed hammer, smaller hammer. We have a larger magazine release button. Still the symbol's the same. We have larger and adjustable rear sights, more of a sight ramp. We do have wraparound grips like a PPK, and you notice they have a thumb rest. There's also a bit of a lip on the front strap to keep your hand from sliding off. So the idea, first off, they didn't apparently like lefties, but the idea was just a more comfortable carry gun, because when you shoot a straight blowback gun, firing a cartridge with more power, these are snappy. They really are. We've done videos on the HK P7, and that's a blowback gun, but it has a gas piston to help mitigate recoil. This doesn't. So even though it's a weaker cartridge, felt recoil is more. Yeah. Oh, and this has the quote-unquote target trigger, the ribbed trigger. I told you they would carry it over to other guns. So Walther would offer these beginning in 1973, and they would be one of the guns that West German police departments could purchase. But the 9x18 didn't prove all that successful. I know that Bavaria issued some of these. Roughly 2,000 were sold to West German police agencies, so it wasn't a total flop. But really, by 1975, it was official that 9x18 was being passed over for 9x19 as the new service round. So effectively, by that year, that was it. Walther would keep these in their catalog until 1979 and then quietly retire them. I never have been able to figure out an entire figure for producing them, but it's not many, a couple of thousand. Interestingly, a New York police department purchased a few of these and issued these. And one problem they had was spare magazines. Walther never really made a lot of spare mags for these because they're unique. And of course, today, ammo is an issue. And there was an export version in .380 sold in America, again imported by Interarms. But I think the 9x18 version is interesting. I picked this up a long time ago. Interesting little flash in the pan. Again, a couple other companies like HK and SIG. I believe Sauer made some too in this cartridge. But 9mm won out. And Walther knew what was coming. In 1974, they introduced another interim solution, the P4. But this was not based on the PP or blowback system. This is based on the P38P1 with its locked breech firing 9x19. And frankly, thanks to its alloy frame, it's about the same weight. Has a shorter barrel than a P1. It's about 8 inches overall, so only about an inch longer. And it actually carried over some features from the PP Super, namely the firing pin safety and decocker only safety and bobbed hammer, although it's a different shape. And actually the adjustable sights from the PP Super would be carried over to the P38K, the shorter version of even this. But even this was an interim solution, although they made more of these, somewhere between 7 and 10,000. And it would kind of be replaced with the true production model offered to police departments, the P5. This actually carried over a similar safety system, adjustable sights, all that, and was really the final evolution of the P38 to the end, but all locked breech guns, effectively ending the era of the Walther blowback that really can be traced all the way back to 1910. So that's really the story, and you've seen my guns before, except for this one. But as I said at the beginning, with a fresh batch of PPs in, for not an unreasonable price considering the quality of these guns. I don't know, I felt like revisiting one of my favorites. In fact, I think my very first handgun purchase that I made myself with my money, didn't ask a family to, whatever, was a PPK. And I've always had a soft spot for them. Of course, yes, because of James Bond, and yes, because of GoldenEye, where it was the PP7. That was from that GoldenEye anniversary video we did. That was a lot of fun. Fox, J-Ro, and I, and Nephew, and others. If you haven't seen it, check it out. One I'm actually very proud of, and we had a blast doing it. More ways than one. But yeah, all good things come to an end, and the PPK had a good run. It really did. Like I said, the original was introduced in 1929. The PPK was introduced in 1931. And they really didn't get changed much. Now, there was an early 90-degree safety variant, and I've owned one before, but not right now. One of those cases, someone offered me more money. But I did get the Dural one thanks to a foreign member and trading customer friend years ago, and it's actually one of my prized possessions. And I actually picked this one up here down in Texas at Collector's Firearms years ago, and I like the kind of rough late war. Wouldn't mind getting a wartime or pre-war PP someday. I just haven't found the right one yet. Until then, my inner arms one here does fine. But yeah, production ended in 1945. But there were so many in the world, and so many were bringbacks, that it became quite famous. And we'll start back up with Manurhin. And then we get the Ohm-marked guns. And there were several copies unlicensed made in other places. And then, of course, East Germany would make some. So they would continue on in manufacture and service through the 60s. And Manurhin and West Germany would make them concurrently, with the Manurhin guns ending by 1986. It gets a little convoluted. They made them for a few years out of license and then stopped. And as far as Ulm in West Germany, their final run, save maybe a commemorative here or there, was in 1992, so shortly after the reunification of West and East Germany. But, of course, there's the U.S. side to it as well. Inner Arms had been the importer since the 50s, and when the 1968 Gun Control Act came down, yes, they imported PPs and PPKSs, but they also wanted to make the PPK in America, the smaller version. So in 1979, a company known as Ranger was contracted with to manufacture, under the Inner Arms name, a PPKS for the U.S. market. And in the 80s, this is what you would get. Now, these were almost always in 380, and usually had a stainless steel finish. West Germany at the time never made stainless steel. They had blued, nickeled, and some engraved stuff. So if you've got a PPK in 380 stainless, bet your dollars to donuts it was made by Ranger, under license from Inner Arms, which itself was under license from Carl Walther. After all, they licensed from herein, and it was actually this switchover of licenses that would end the thing with herein officially. And Ranger would continue, and Inner Arms would continue through the 1990s, even into the era of the P99. And with the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, Smith & Wesson would take over import duties and even some manufacturing duties. And so you started to see the Smith & Wesson branded guns, including an updated version of the PPK with a little bit more of a beaver tail on the back to protect your hand. These are always in 382. And they changed the feed ramp and chamber to make them feed hollow points more reliably. So the Smith & Wesson PPK/PPKSs had a few other little product improvements. And Smith & Wesson would handle importation and manufacture and distribution all the way up until 2012. And then in 2013, Walther USA would go online right here in Arkansas, right next to me in Fort Smith, and they're the ones that are doing it today, including offering a version of the PPK assembled in the U.S., which they started off early on, but by 2018 they did them full steam ahead. They also imported a version of the PPKS in 22. And over in Europe, for a time, Hungary would manufacture a licensed variant of the PPKS known as the PPKE, which is meant to be a more economical version because of labor cost in Germany. And this was official through Walther. So you've got Walther USA, Smith & Wesson before them in the U.S. making guns, and you have the PPKE made in Hungary. I don't believe the PPKE is made anymore. I could be wrong. I've kind of wanted to own one, but never enough to really get hardcore about it. You know, if one came my way, that'd be great. But the PPKS is really made for nostalgia today. It is an old design. It's still a good design, but let's be honest, it's over 90 years old. So it's for nostalgia. I think this is also why we don't see PP production, because people want what they can't have. Yeah, the PPK. But I still like it. So people don't. They find them snappy. I will say it is much more pleasant in 32 versus 380 to shoot, especially the PPK. There's more to grip onto with the PP, so it's a little better. I find the 380 version much snappier. In fact, it is because of this gun that I don't own 380s. When I was getting into guns years ago, I decided I didn't need every cartridge. So I went with 32 and 9x18 Makarov, mostly because a lot of guns chambered for those were available in the late 90s. And I just kept on there. And then when I shot a 380 PPK, I thought, well, I don't like this as much as my 32. And I don't find them as reliable. And that seems to be the kind of consensus. The thinner and thereby longer 32 just seems to work better. And the Germans seem to think so as well. In World War II, the military did everything they could to standardize on 32. That's not to say there weren't some 380s in service, but that was usually what they took when they had no other choice. When they ever placed a contract, it was for 32, 7.65. Sometimes called 7.65 Browning. And then, of course, this would continue into West and even East Germany. This seemed to just be the preferred cartridge. And I understand why. Plus, you do get one extra round, no matter PPK. And even though you can consider it a failure, I think the PP Super was quite interesting as well. But it's debatable if it's really a PPK at that point. I should say that Fritz Walther would pass away in 1966, so getting the company well established, and it would transfer to a new owner, but still being privately owned at the time. And it's still in Ulm today, although much has changed. And it's an interesting place. I visited there way back in 2007. Love to go back, but that was then, this is now. And I find these guns special. Can't tell you why, but a lot of people find HKP 7s and such special, and I like them, but yeah, these are kind of my bag. I think part of it is cost. I just always found Walthers to be that good, acceptable value for cost thing, and there's a lot of history behind them. They've armed German soldiers for a very long time, World War I, World War II, Cold War era, and of course the James Bond connection doesn't hurt. So with that, let's wrap it up. And I'm curious, which variant do you like? PP, PPK, PPKS, or none of the above? And which cartridge, which caliber would you prefer? 32, 380? Maybe you think 1 in 25 would be fun. Or 22. They are available. Both past and present. Let me know. Let's talk about them. Which one do you like the look of? I don't know. I just like talking about these guns. Kind of gets me excited still. And as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, you know the deal, Patreon, and you know our next live stream. When I'm recording this, I don't know when that'll be, but I'll get better at updating things. I'm learning, guys. Yeah, some of the guns that have followed me throughout my entire firearms career, and that are just very special to me. But question for you to end with: what's special to you? What's your equivalent? I've shown you mine. How about you talk about yours? With that, this is Misha, and catch you very soon next time.